Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Well, that's particularly good advice for today's political situation, I can tell you. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. Well, that's what I learned from studying the history of totalitarianism in the 20th century, is that a corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit. And that's for sure. And it's so funny, you know, people who think, when they're thinking about their relationship with divinity or their relationship with God, they think it's a primitive and childish way of thinking. What if a miracle just manifests? Why can't a miracle just manifest itself? And I would be convinced. And the funny thing is first of all, actually you wouldn't be. If a miracle actually happened, you would actually forget about it in about 6 months. I mean, you'd think that's not true, but it's true. You would actually forget about it because that's what people are like. But there are negative miracles that are happening all the time, which actually lends some credence to my supposition, and we don't pay any attention to that. If we can't learn from what happened in the 20th century, then we are absolutely incapable of learning. Because what happened in the 20th century was as bitter a set of lessons as you could possibly imagine. And it's associated precisely with this. A corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit. Neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Well, that's a flood motif right there. It's like we're constantly the archetype of the tree. That's the archetype of being. It's the archetype of the self often. What's the warning here? It's that if you're mostly dead wood, you're going to burn up. And you can think about that metaphysically. You can project that into eternity, and you can think about that as a form of hell. And the funny thing is that when that's happening to you in real time, it is like an eternity in hell. It's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about it. But you can strip the metaphysical elements off, and you can say, well, if you're mostly dead wood, then a spark will light you on fire. And that's also very much worth thinking about. Wherefore by their fruits shall ye know them. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven. That's an interesting line, I think. I mean, one of the proper critiques of traditional Christianity, maybe this is the sort of critique that Nietzsche put forth, was that Christianity had degenerated in its moral mission. Jung was a little bit more sympathetic, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but Nietzsche's idea was that Christianity had lost its way when it generated the presupposition that humanity was saved in some final sense by the sacrifice of Christ. It meant that the work was already done, and that, and I'm being harsh in my judgment for the purpose of rhetorical simplification, but the idea was that if you just professed faith that that had already occurred, then you were granted eternal salvation. It's like, well, it's not so straightforward, and I think that that's what this line actually represents. It says, how do you enter into the kingdom of heaven? And again, you can think about that under the aspect of eternity, or you can think about it as a psychological statement, and the answer is quite straightforward, is that you do what Noah did to make him immune from the flood, and that's to walk with God. And that's what this sermon is about. It's laying out the practical elements of that. And the practical elements are aim at the highest possible good and play that out in the world, and then you may have the opportunity to inhabit the highest possible good that you're positing into existence. Perhaps not, but you can't think of any more practical way of going about that. I mean, if you build a house, then maybe you can live in it. If you don't build a house, you're not going to be able to live in it. If you build a good house, then you'll be able to live in a good house. And if you build a perfect house, then maybe you can live in a perfect house. But if you just say that the house has already been built for you, and that you can just say that the house is being built for you, well then the probability that you're going to be able to live where you need to live is There's no probability that you're going to be able to live where you need to live. Many will say to me in that day, that's the judgment day, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works. And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. See, that's judgment day, you know. That's an archetypal idea. And partly it's archetypal because every day is judgment day. And the part of you that's equivalent to the logos, say, the part of you that's your own ideal, sits in eternal judgment on your iniquity. And that's the source of guilt and shame and withdrawal, and then resentment, and then murderousness, and then genocide. It's because you can intuit the ideal, and the problem with intuiting the ideal is that an ideal is always a judge. There's no difference between an ideal and a judge, and so you're eternally judged by your own ideal. If you have no ideal, well then you've got no direction and no meaning in your life. And then of course the more extreme the ideal, the harsher the judge. That's actually why Jung was very curious about why the book of Revelation was tacked on to the Bible, because the book of Revelation, that's a very weird book. And you know, in the Gospels, Christ is, I would say, perhaps primarily merciful. There's maybe a war in his character between truth and mercy, but it's one of the two, perhaps mercy. And Jung's observation was the gospel Christ was too merciful. And that's why the book of Revelation was tacked on to the New Testament, because in the book of Revelation, Christ, who's the ideal, who's above the pyramid, right, the transcendent ideal, is nothing but a judge, and everyone fails. And of course, the ultimate ideal is the ultimate judge. And so that's the archetypal reality there. And you can say, well, I don't want to be judged, and so I'll dispense with the ideal. But then you're Cain, because Cain is exactly the person who dispenses with the ideal. And so there's no escaping from it. There's no escaping from eternal judgment. That's the archetypal story.